An excerpt from Notes on Discipline by Stephen Graham, 1919, I believe, published in, let me look. Notes on Discipline was published or appeared in the English Review, 1919, I suspect. But this excerpt is interesting. It was decided in 1917 that after the war, a monument would be raised on every battlefield in France and Flanders, graven with the names of the dead, and that underneath the names should be written some fitting motto. It was regarded as essential that the motto should be the same in all the monuments, but a suitable motto had not been found. A committee was at work deliberating on the details and trying to decide what the motto should be, and one evening in the new year, shortly after I had come up to London from that little Sparta, where I was trained, I met at a friend's house other friends, and we discussed this fascinating and, I think, sacred choice. Certain celebrated men had made suggestions, so one who was on the committee said, and he gave us a list of mottos, such as "They died for freedom," and "What I gave, I have," and "My utmost for the highest," and Kipling's happy words, "Who stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live?" "Go tell to Sparta" was mentioned, and in putting the choice to the company, we were set thinking about the war and the soldier in a special way. It touched each man's heart and made him responsive to the great tragedy in France. Some of the suggestions might seem prosaic and ordinary, set down coldly in print, but with the thoughts of the heart softening and spiritualizing them as they were said, each had a poetry of its own. The truest note of the evening seemed to me to be in words suggested by one of the company, "By their sacrifice we live," or in, "They died that we might live." And I should have liked that to stand. The one that had most favour was "My utmost for the highest," a celestial motto for the living, but perhaps too striving for those who now sleep sweetly sleep, whilst the days and the years roll by. One thought that seemed to weigh was that the motto would be equally acceptable to Mohammedans and to Christians alike, and that "By their sacrifice we live" was too Christian an idea, and being fresh from little Sparta barracks, I thought to myself, if the mystical Christian idea of sacrifice is not available, why not the Spartan splendour of discipline, and "Tell to Sparta thou that passest by, that here obedient to her laws we lie." Since then, a motto has been chosen, the one found by Kipling in Ecclesiasticus, "Their name liveth for evermore," which for us means that their fame liveth for ever, their good name liveth for ever, and mankind will be eternally grateful to those who died to rid us of tyranny and war. Perhaps what the soldiers have done is destined to be recognized as years go on. As it is, in the war we have thought too lightly of our men in their wounds and their death. There has been too little sense of gratitude to the man who has laid down his life on the altar, because it was his duty he was doing, because we knew him disciplined to go to it unflinching. We have involuntarily discounted his sacrifice. At home, munition workers and civilians of all kinds lived in comfort and in money, and bought war loan stock, and felt they also were doing their bit, as if there were any similarity between their lives and those of the men at the front. The soldier who was doing his duty, the idea of duty rather than of sacrifice has prevailed, something due paid rather than something sacred made. And yet, every man who died on these fields was offered up on the altar for Europe's sins. Now, I find this a very interesting section of this book. It's in the very beginning, and this is a book which I've spoken in one of my other videos before. It's by Stephen Gray. It's called A Private and the Guards. It's not the same book that I spoke about in my video for the cenotaph. But what I find interesting here is just a few little things. One is the discussion of trying to figure out an epitaph. You know, you read epitaphs all the time when you pass monuments in parks, in gardens, by the wayside. And you don't think too much about them. They just sort of exist there, as if they have always existed there. And you realize that at one point in time, someone decided what motto should be engraved in this statue or should be written on that plaque. And it's quite a important thing to do. It's quite a responsibility to choose the right fitting words. And what I find interesting is that these men who fought in the war are trying to not justify, but trying to pick something which has the resonance not just for themselves who understood the war, but a resonance that might touch individuals in society, civilians, who do not understand the war they fought, but yet by these words they choose, they might perhaps understand it a little better, or might understand the gravity, the enormity of it. It's an impossible task, of course. And as well, the soldiers who survived, there's an interesting idea that, you know, the soldiers who died, what would they choose as a motto in comparison to the soldiers who lived and survived and who remained? And you ask yourself the question, would there be any difference between a soldier who saw battle in the same battlefield as a soldier who died? If the soul of a soldier who died could speak with a soldier of the same battlefield who lived, what would be their conversation? What could they agree on? Would there be a difference of opinion? Would there be a different interpretation of the battle they just had fought? Would there be a different interpretation of the war? How far would the opinions be different? What is the difference there? And you can't answer that question, but it's interesting to dwell upon and to imagine. Maybe one day when we part this temporal, corporal world, we might talk to folk who had fought in these wars, and we can ask them directly, but who knows about that? And of course, I like his bringing up of the Spartan Motto. And for those of you who don't know, okay, I'll just quote it here from the book. Tell to Sparta, thou that passest by, that here obedient to her laws we lie. What that is referencing is the Battle of Thermopylae, where, as the legend goes, 300 Spartans held the hot gates, or this pass between a mountain and the coast, the Persian army of Xerxes, from coming into Attica and attacking Hellas, the Hellenes. And they stood there knowing they were going to die, and they held off for as long as possible the Persians from entering in, well, more towards their homeland. And they died. The Greeks erected a monument on that site, and I believe they put on that monument, Tell to a Sparta, thou that passest by, that here obedient to her laws we lie. And what they mean by saying, to her laws we lie, is referencing the Spartan Code. The Spartan Code being, the Spartan law is infamous or famous, depending which way you look at it, for being incredibly disciplined, a law which created soldiers from a young age through an intensely selected process, which had all sorts of strange and if not immoral methods for producing hard, not death-loving, but hard warriors who would go to battle in an expectation that's almost ecstatic, and it was ritualistic. It was their way of life. And to the Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae, and to people who look upon the Spartans, that is their zenith of the moment that most represents their values and their sort of manliness and whatnot. Anyway, it's interesting in reference to the First World War because Stephen Graham often alludes to this sort of Spartan mentality, especially with his guards, because he was in the guards, the guards of the Queen's Guards, and they really modelled their training and their way of fighting, not modelled, but they alluded to Spartan ethics. And Stephen Graham talks about in this book how some of these units, I think he mentioned 6 of the units the British had, were probably the best units in the entire war. Now, that's probably biased, but there is good reason to believe in it. And he often talked about the differences between the German structure and their units and the British structures, and that the private soldier, he was obviously in a hierarchy where under the command of a sergeant, an NCO, but ultimately under the command of an officer, and that officer being under the command of an officer, that the British had a different ethos in contra to the Germans. The Germans had a very, they obviously had a hierarchical system, but the Germans, what Stephen Graham claims, their route to discipline came out of strict conduct, strict discipline, out of pretty harsh relationship between the officers and the soldiers. Whereas Stephen Graham says, and this is a chap who actually fought in the war and was under officers, British officers, and he said that the soldiers admired, this is not a quote, but just from memory, that the soldiers admired their officers. They looked up to them in general. They had a good relationship with them. Even though there was a sort of class difference, there was a camaraderie. And he talks about how on the battlefield, the Germans more often surrendered to the British than the British to the Germans. And he put this down generally to the fact that the British soldiers were less likely to surrender because they were more loyal to their officers, whereas the German soldiers were less loyal to their officers because their officers were draconian in their methods, and it resulted in them being more likely to surrender. Anyway, I go off on tangents. I find it just fascinating, this whole reading first-hand experience of the First World War. Let me give you the example, and I read this from the same passage. Our discipline, even at its worst or best, let us say at its harshest, had been upheld by the sense of a true moral cause, and it has been tempered by something which our officers brought into the army, something which the German officers were not allowed to bring, or did not possess to bring. Their system was based exclusively on fear. The men hated their officers, but were afraid of them. They dared not disobey whatever they were asked to do, however dangerous. Our men are different in this way. They admire their officers and more readily sacrifice their own lives, seeing their leaders sacrifice theirs. German intensified discipline made it possible for them to launch attacks led by men themselves, whilst the officers remained in comparative safety behind. In our attacks, however, the officers have led the men, and though losses in personnel have been disproportionately great, the troops thus led have generally behaved better than the Germans. There has been less surrender. Parties have fought stubbornly after they had been surrounded, and when there was no chance of escape. But the Germans obtained a name for themselves by shouting out, "Kamerad, Kamerad," and wishing to surrender the moment they were cut off or felt safe from the disciplinary shots behind them. It's interesting. I don't know how true it is, and historians will obviously have better insight to all of this, but it seems from the surface, and I'm not just taking this from this book, but understanding the difference between Prussian system and Anglo-British systems, of not understanding completely, but from what I've read over the years and what I've watched and what I've listened to, the Prussians are famous for what you call Prussian militarism, and their command structure is heavily based on fear, and that's what they use to drive their soldiers forward. Now, that is not the case all the way through, but it's just interesting to notice the difference between the two forces. And Stephen Graham makes the passing comment that the discipline of the British soldiers in their different method of acting had an effect on the war. And an example of that is his claim that the Germans would more readily surrender than the British. Anyway, it's fascinating. I'm just going to finish on the last section of this article. If we had all understood Christianity as Tolstoy understood it, Germany would have won. If we had all been merely brave and gone out to fight, moved by the spirit, we should probably have lost. These facts we knew, and although the seeming defeat of the ideal might have been more glorious and even more serviceable to humanity as a whole than the prolonged conflict, we chose to fight Germany in Germany's way. We imitated her machines, including the greatest of all, namely the man-machine, whose principle is discipline. Perhaps in our way we have improved that machine and shown where its defects lie. The curious discovery has been made by both sides that men of all ages, classes, temperaments, and states of health can be fitted into it, and the weakest individuals will often fight the best now that the war is over. However, we must not forget that for many the greatest ordeal was not the field of battle, but the field of training, where men, infinitely diverse in character, originality, and expression, were standardized to become interchangeable parts in the fighting machine. What our men of all ages, professions, and temperaments have to go through to become soldiers. And then how stern and choiceless the road to victory and death. And that's the main part of this article. This whole article is discipline in the army is supposed to be instilled to remove as much as possible thinking from the chain of command. Now, armies want thinking in their soldiers. They want them to be able to act and react and to be intelligent. But what they do not want is for orders to be disobeyed, because then the generals who are looking at their maps and their information cannot reliably instruct their soldiers to do as they see fit. And so it's incredibly important that the civilian soldier taken off the street is not broken down, but so to speak, broken down and molded into the soldier and made to understand that their emotions and their misgivings are only that, and they must remain that, and that to go forward and fight is their obligation, and they just go forward. And that's what happened in the First World War. These men, quite gladly, out of a sense of patriotism, out of a sense of manly virtues, all these things, whether for good or bad, this is what it was, they went on and fought and died. And they did it gladly, and others didn't do it so gladly, but they did it anyway. And it's amazing some of the letters you may come across when you read about the First World War, because the letters that soldiers would write just before going over the top are some of the most heart-wrenching, some of the most soul-destroying letters you have ever come across. Because these men know they're going to die. They know that going over the top is certain death, and they're only lucky if they do survive. And they accept that fate. They don't question it. Or if they ever so gently question it, it's only passingly. Anyway, I don't really have a point to this video, apart from the fact that I just started the recording and read a transcript and started speaking. But it's good to do this.